The moment Eva was humiliated in front of the entire community did not come from some sudden explosion, but felt like the inevitable result of long, smoldering days in which judging eyes, whispered comments, faint mocking smiles and cold silences slowly tightened around her like an invisible noose. At that dinner at Fairmont Crest, Kat and a few seemingly neutral faces had, whether unintentionally or very deliberately, pulled that noose to its final limit. Small details were subtly arranged, old stories dragged back into the light between the clinking of crystal, suggestive comparisons made between Eva's past and the immaculate image this community worshipped. No one condemned her outright, but everything was guided to cast Eva as a stain out of place in that polished setting. They didn't have to say it clearly. Her reputation had once been loud enough that the mere mention of her name made the atmosphere sink in exactly the direction they wanted. Eva stood there, forcing her spine to remain straight, trying to show she was immune to the crowd, but somewhere deep in her chest, something cracked. She realized she was not only being judged, but tested, pushed to the edge to expose her weakness, to give others an excuse to confirm she did not belong here. Kat, with her composed exterior, might tell herself she had only contributed a few harmless stories, but the exchanged glances, the strained smiles from certain people told Eva very clearly. This was no accident, but a setup conveniently used by those who had always waited to see her fall. But instead of collapsing, Eva chose a different path. On the way back, beneath the extravagant lights of Fairmont Crest that now seemed to mock her, Eva no longer wept in secret over an act of public shaming. She felt something colder, sharper, rising within. She looked back at the entire power structure of this place, the hypocritical Duprees, the calculating Richardsons, the self-appointed pillars of the community, and all the faces who had watched her being dissected like a spectacle. In that stillness, Eva understood that if she kept standing alone, she was nothing but prey waiting to be torn apart. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to return each cut she had just received, she needed another force. And the only person who understood the system deeply enough, who was ruthless enough, and who had enough blood debt with it, was the one she had avoided all her life, Leslie. The meeting between Eva and Leslie was not a reconciliatory embrace, not a flood of mother-daughter tears seeking forgiveness. It was a cold space, where two women saw in each other not just a blood tie, but strategic potential. In Leslie's eyes still lingered the dark trace of someone who had lived too long with buried humiliation and secrets bought into silence. Eva entered carrying her trampled pride, her provoked rage, and the merciless clarity of a new generation. The pact between them was forged not through promises of love, but through a lucid understanding. Leslie needed a younger, sharper version of herself to complete the retaliation she could not execute alone. Eva needed power, experience, and fragments of the past that only Leslie possessed. They did not forgive each other, at least not yet. They simply agreed to step onto a new front, where the goal was no longer to carve out a small place in the community, but to pierce the sanctimonious mask of the families that had stood upon their bodies to build their power. As the two women sat facing each other in the closed room, the layers of memory Leslie had buried began to surface. The years she carried Eva in a scandalous pregnancy, when the reputation of a wealthy family risked collapse because of a child conceived in the wrong place. Back then, Leslie believed the storm had been contained by the invisible hands of Ted or some vague force within the Fairmont Crest power network. Records were altered, papers vanished, threats cloaked in polite words but edged with ice cut off every question. Leslie was paid, arranged, pressed into silence like an unnecessary detail tidied out of sight. But the more she looked into Eva's eyes, the more she pieced together the scattered scraps of information accumulated over the years, the more clearly Leslie saw the name behind those arrangements that had never been spoken aloud: Vernon. Vernon, the moral emblem of Fairmont Crest, the man at the helm of charitable funds and community projects, the one who always appeared at the right time to shield crises. He stood at the crossroads of money, law, media, and honor. At the same time, fresh details about a private funding system linked to community charities around Fairmont Crest began to emerge, not as a screeching halt, but as small fractures spidering across glass. Sums of money had been moved through intermediary accounts bearing the name of someone from Leslie's old story, a doctor or lawyer who had mysteriously vanished after handling the aftermath of an accident, a swap, or a truth about bloodlines that needed to be buried. It stopped being coincidence when Eva, through a connection with a retired lawyer, pried out an old agreement from a safe. On it was Vernon's signature alongside clauses regarding payment, care, and guaranteed silence for Leslie and the unborn child. The moment Eva saw that signature, the entire structure in her mind shifted. Vernon was not merely an external fixer, he was anchored at the center of the cleanup operation. The question that rose in her mind was not how much he had paid, but why he had to intervene so deeply. Leslie, her hands trembling as she touched the page, felt the shame of the past resurrected, this time fused with a lucid, burning fury. If Vernon had only cleaned up others' mistakes, why did every trail lead back to his funds, his people, his conveniently timed projects that legalized the flow of money? And if he was the root, the one who chose to protect a family's reputation by shoving Leslie into darkness, then what was his long-standing image as a moral icon if not pure theater? And if the truth about Eva's parentage or another member of the community was dragged into the light, how grotesquely would the power dynamics warp? As Eva and Leslie assembled the pieces, Vernon's on-screen presence began to change. He was no longer just the composed man delivering public speeches. New scenes showed him sitting alone at night before security monitors, rewinding footage from the compound gates, checking each license plate, opening his safe, combing through medical files of certain young people in the community, even reviewing report cards, scholarship records, sponsorship programs. There was no blood, no screaming, no chase, but his meticulous, silent vigilance made the atmosphere sinister. The audience could feel he was guarding something, like a gatekeeper keeping demons out, or perhaps the very man who once opened the gate, now standing guard to keep the truth from flooding through. Questions began to form. Was Vernon protecting someone from being hurt, or binding someone to an unspoken sentence they could never escape? Eva was no longer just angry about being shamed. She saw herself as the outcome of a chain of arrangements in which men like Vernon had decided the terms of her existence before she was even born. Her outrage no longer pointed at Kat or the people who had delighted in breaking her down that evening. They were merely unconscious supporting players. Eva's new target was the hypocritical foundation of Fairmont Crest, where those at the top wore the costume of benefactors preaching family and opportunity while quietly choosing who was allowed to exist, who must be hidden, who counted as legitimate and who had to be sacrificed so others could stay pure. Her alliance with Leslie was no longer just a transaction of interests, but the convergence of two generations shaped by the same controlling hand. At the Fairmont Crest fundraising gala, Eva appeared so flawlessly that, for a few seconds, all old gossip felt brutally severed. Every detail, from her dress to her gaze to her posture, broadcast that she had not come to beg acceptance, but to claim ground. Vernon, in front of the crowd, lifted her up as the new face of the community, a representative of a modern, forward-looking vision. Kat, Nicole, Danny, Anita watched with emotions they could not fully mask: discomfort, alarm, suspicion. Why would Vernon, who always preached propriety, favor someone with a tarnished backstory like Eva? That sudden favor only poured more fuel on Eva's fire. His handshake, his nod of approval, were no longer honors, but reminders. This was the man who believed he held the right to define her worth. Now he would become the axis of the collapse she and Leslie were engineering. Leslie chose a moment close to the gala to leak part of the documents tied to Vernon's charity to an independent journalist or blogger known for exposing the dark underbelly of humanitarian projects. Not everything, just enough to create the first public hairline crack of doubt. A handful of questions about suspicious transfers, about links between the fund and a vanished figure, began to circulate. Vernon instantly sensed someone was digging. He tightened control, narrowed his circle of trust, called private meetings, issued quiet gag orders, rifled through records, scrutinized anyone who might betray him. The harder he tried to protect his secret, the more chilling his image became: the probing eyes, the fist closing around the safe key, the unervingly calm demeanor when confronted with inquiries, as if this were not his first time facing the threat of truth breaking through. From his side, Vernon did not sit still. He hired people to tail Leslie, parked cars in the dark outside her house, let camera flashes flicker and vanish, let silent figures move in the background, let calls go unanswered. Without laying a hand on her, simply by manufacturing the feeling of being hunted and surrounded, Vernon delivered his message: he knew someone was playing with fire. Leslie realized she had re-entered a game with an opponent who had never truly left the board. But unlike the past, this time she was not alone, and fear was no longer enough to shut her down. Eva watched all of this and took another step. She arranged a private meeting with Vernon in a setting that seemed harmless. There were no direct accusations, only suggestive remarks, nods to loyalty and sacrifice for the community, the idea that sometimes losses must be accepted to protect the greater good. Vernon, falling into the familiar posture of a man used to controlling narratives, dropped phrases that exposed the philosophy he had long used to justify ruthless choices. Eva recorded the conversation. It was not a full confession to a specific crime, but the steady, calm voice speaking of sacrificing a few individuals for collective honor was chilling enough. To Eva, that recording was not just leverage, it was a mirror reflecting the moral code Fairmont Crest had been bowing to. In a dark corner, Leslie witnessed that moment. She watched her daughter face Vernon with a cold, contained confidence and understood that Eva was no longer the wounded girl running from her past, but a woman willing to wield the very tools of powerful men to shift the board. Leslie cried, but not with soft, redemptive tears. It was a warped fusion of resurrected pain and grim satisfaction at seeing the man who once decided her fate slowly being dragged down from his pedestal. Yet, woven into that feeling was another question: by turning Eva into the spearhead, was she pushing her daughter into the same darkness where Vernon had once stood? Anita began to sense that the story around Vernon no longer fit inside the frame of a simple straying husband, vague calls, or plausible excuses. She felt everything skew off-center, as if her marriage were only a surface shield hiding an intricate network of ruthless decisions beyond her reach. Small signs unsettled her: Vernon's peculiar interest in certain young people, the way he controlled family information, his unervingly composed reaction to accusations about the charity. She had only brushed the surface of the iceberg, but her instincts warned that beneath it lay more than infidelity or money, something that, if exposed, would shatter her entire understanding of the man beside her. Eva and Leslie were acutely aware of the balance. If they struck too softly, Vernon would have time to seal the cracks, pin the blame on others, sacrifice a few pawns to preserve his image. If they struck too hard, the secrets about Eva, Leslie, and the tangled lineage between families would explode into chaos, and it would not only be Vernon who fell. Anita, Nicole, Danny, Kat, the entire Fairmont Crest community would be pulled into the storm, and there was no guarantee that mother and daughter would not be crushed along with the people they wanted to destroy. The weapon in their hands was both an opportunity for vengeance and a blade that could swing back at them. They had to choose how far to ignite, which link to break first, and whether they were willing to pay the price once the line between victim and manipulator began to blur. In the hush before the inevitable eruption, each central figure found themselves forced up against an invisible wall. Eva had to confront whether she was reclaiming justice or replicating the same cold logic of those who once ruled over her fate. Leslie had to choose between pulling her daughter out to protect her, or accepting that Eva was the only one strong enough to bring Vernon down, even if that meant pushing her deeper into the dark. Vernon had to decide whom to sacrifice next to keep his secret, and whether he could still believe he was acting for some greater good. Anita had to face the possibility that the man she trusted as a moral anchor might be the very core of their nightmare. Kat and the others who helped stage Eva's humiliation would realize they had unwittingly triggered an alliance no one anticipated, and when the counterattack came, the side they chose would redefine their place in Beyond the Gates. Behind the gates of Fairmont Crest, guarded by cameras, security, rules and polished speeches, one final question grew heavier in the silence: who is truly the most terrifying? Vernon, with his remorseless decisions disguised as protection of the community? Eva and Leslie, with a plan of destruction that could burn everything down? Or the system itself, which allowed dirty bargains to become an accepted cost of power? And once a single shard of truth is pulled from the dark, is there any path back, or have they all already stepped too far into a place where no one is clean enough to stand outside the war?